We're joined by four people who know a lot about this epidemic, about the problems that we're trying to figure out and face up. But no one on this panel knows as much about the life that this mother described as Zach Varda. Zach, by the way, is a journalist. He is editor of the right title, editor of the student newspaper at Ohio State University. And Zach also is currently recovering from how many years of using?
Years of using?
Yeah.
About 4 or 5, somewhere in there.
How would you answer that mother's question? She said, how could he have done this?
I guess, well, I had one relapse the first time I tried to get clean. Only 6 months of sobriety, and I relapsed. I guess the answer I would give is that it never really goes away. It's always in the back of your mind. Even if the daily obsession goes away, it's always there. I'm roughly 4.5 years clean now, but I still have dreams about heroin, probably on a weekly basis. It's just something that never goes away, and it's such a powerful hook, and it's always right there waiting for you to slip up. You mess up once, and they say it in AA or NA programs like that. Your addiction's waiting out in the parking lot to catch you whenever you slip, and so it really only takes 5 minutes of weakness for you to throw away a year, 2 years, however long, and go back to using.
Given what we know about this addiction, is there a way for you to rationalize why anyone would start down this trail?
I don't think there's not really a rational.
It's not a
reason.
Rational act.
Yeah, it's not a rational act. It wasn't my personal experience to start with painkillers. The first opioid I ever did was heroin. But for a lot of people, it's very rational that it starts with painkillers, and
Sure.
That just becomes way too expensive. If you have a prescription and then you're addicted and then you want to go out in the street and get painkillers, that's going to just be, that's going to be too expensive. So you're going to go to heroin. It's a lot cheaper. So there's never a rational reason, but eventually you just reach the point where your body is going to overpower anything your mind's telling you because it needs it, and you're going to give in to what it's telling you it needs.
While you were using, how did you think about yourself and your own worth? And
there is a lot of lying to yourself, and
lying how?
Just telling yourself it's not as bad. So one really common one, the first year I used heroin, I did not inject it. So that's a common one where people that don't inject it say, well, I use heroin, but I'm not using needles. That's a very common rationalization where...
Snorted?
Yeah. So that's a very common rationalization where you tell yourself, well, I'm not using needles. It can't be that bad. And then once you get to the needles, it's like, well, I'm a heroin addict, but I'm not using meth, so it can't be that bad. So there's just a bunch of rationalizations to tell yourself that it's going to continue to be okay. For the last couple of years of my addiction, I was still working a couple of jobs just to be able to finance my addiction. So that was kind of the rationalization I told myself.
How expensive was it?
I was probably dropping anywhere from $100 to $200 a day.
A day?
Yeah. So I probably worked like 50 to 60 hours a day, a week, and I'd have money by the end of the week. In fact, I had to go out and find ways to make extra money on the side. So yeah, I think everybody finds their own way to rationalize why they're not as bad as the next guy, because I think everybody, if you're using, other users, and you can always find someone worse than you. So you always tell yourself you're not as bad as the next guy, and then that makes you feel okay about what you're doing.
What helped you? We spend so much time as journalists talking about the problem that we don't spend nearly as much time talking about what helped. Where did it turn for you that you were able to start saying, wait, I can do something here?
I finally hit a day where I couldn't get anything, and the withdrawals were too much. For most of the time, I might have to do withdrawals for like an hour in the morning, but, I'd eventually get my fix and, then I'm good. But I went through a whole day where just, confluence of circumstances, I couldn't get high. And I was also kind of reaching a point where heroin wasn't getting me high anymore to begin with, where, I had used like a gram at a time, or $100 worth at a time, just to feel normal. So you just kind of reach that point where you can't, the phrase is you're sick and tired of being sick and tired. And that just gets to be too much. So I just could not find any. It was one day. The withdrawals are so bad, you're shaking. It's basically like you're, having a small seizure and you're throwing up and, you have to sit in a hot bath because you're so cold, you're shivering. And that was just the point where it was too much. And I always had the support of my family through the entire thing. I was never thrown to the wayside by my family. And without that support, I definitely never would have got through, to getting, clean.
What doesn't work?
What doesn't work?
Shaming.
Shaming, being told that you need to get better. The first time I went to rehab, that was not by my choice. And the entire time I was in there, I knew I was going to use when I got out. So it doesn't really help if I'm in rehab and they're sitting here giving me all these tips on how to stay clean if I don't intend to stay clean. I personally was never incarcerated, but I know people who intentionally went and got themselves incarcerated. They would view going to jail as a way to detox. So you go to jail for a couple months. When you get back out, your tolerance is dropped. You get a brand new high. A lot of people, that's just, the punitive side of things. If I was worried about the consequences of doing heroin, I never would have started it.
Marlene Harris-Taylor, you've heard stories like Zach for a long time. You've been covering this story for IdeaStream for a long time.
Well, I've been covering the story for IdeaStream. For those of you who may not know, IdeaStream is the PBS NPR affiliate in Cleveland, Ohio. I've been covering it for IdeaStream for about 2 years and about 4 years before that for the Toledo Blade newspaper. So I've been on this story for a while. And, the story in Cleveland is probably the same story that you would hear in just about every major metropolitan area in Ohio. The overdose deaths continue to climb. Although it was interesting, our medical examiner in Cleveland earlier in the year thought he saw that things were stabilizing, and that meaning that the overdose deaths were not climbing like they were year over year. And he attributed that primarily to Narcan use, to people saving people from overdosing with Narcan on naloxone. But as the year went on, there started to be more spikes in overdose deaths in the community. And he often will say that we don't have a heroin overdose problem, we have a fentanyl overdose problem in the Cleveland area. I mean, just recently there was over a 5-day period, there were 16 overdoses in Cleveland, and of 14 of those, fentanyl was the major factor. And usually when people overdose, they have a mix of drugs in their system. It's not just one drug, it's not just heroin, there's usually heroin, fentanyl. And the analogs of fentanyl, as they call it, the synthetic drug, the medical examiner tells us is really a problem because the people who produce these drugs, they can change it chemically just slightly, and then it's difficult for people who are doing examinations after the fact to find that drug. So it keeps changing over time with the use of fentanyl and analogs. One of the other interesting things he shared with us is that meth is on the rise. You mentioned meth, Zach. And he said that users are starting to use meth to sort of supplement their addiction. I just heard there was a big conference in Cleveland about a year ago with Cleveland Clinic and all the major hospitals and everybody in town who has something to do with trying to fight this epidemic. And they said that the seizures of meth in Cuyahoga County have increased 50% over the last year. And I spoke with the DEA agent who's from the Detroit office who covers Ohio and Michigan, and he said there was for a couple reasons. He said that people who are addicted will often use meth to help with those withdrawal symptoms until they can get their hands on some opioids. He also said that you have to think of these people who distribute drugs, these cartels, as business people. And this is just built in as part of their business model to distribute the meth along with the heroin. Perhaps they have a glut in meth right now, so they'll push it down to the lower level dealers and say, when you give people some heroin, make sure you're giving them some meth too.
Marlene, I'm going to cut away from you and come right back. Lieutenant Dave Garrow from the Akron Police Department, are you seeing this trend here too, this rise in meth sales?
Yeah, meth is certainly on the upswing. In fact, it's probably the most prevalent drug in the community right now. As far as the opioids, fentanyl, carfentanyl's all but disappeared. Fentanyl's still around. Heroin's still around. But I noticed, many of the slides I saw earlier, and a lot of statistics were a couple years old. And I want to tell everybody here that things are looking up in terms of the heroin epidemic. It is on, at least in Summit County in the city of Akron, it's on the down slope. I've got a...
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? I don't know. I mean, I think it's as varied as there are a number of people that use. Some people are using meth and other drugs because they want to stay away from the heroin because they know it'll kill them. It's sad to say, but I don't know if you could find one of my charts there and bring it up. But in the city of Akron over the last 2.5, 3 years, we've probably had 500 people die from heroin fentanyl overdoses. That's 500 users or people who were using that are no longer using anymore. 500 might have been a little bit high, but we're certainly 300 pushing 400. And maybe there just aren't as many users still. What I will tell you, though, is that the good news is, as you can see up here through the 18th of this month, the total number of overdoses in the city of Akron, as people who've overdosed and lived, died, whatever, just overdosed on some kind of a drug, is significantly down. We've only had 420 overdoses so far in the city of Akron. In the city of Akron, as of a couple days ago, we had 39 confirmed deaths. What I'm going to suggest to you, and you can see the number of deaths is way, way down, and that's a good thing. 39 is still not an acceptable number. But what I'm going to suggest is that maybe it's not a opioid problem as much as it is an addiction problem, and also as much as it's a mental health problem.
Can I ask you a couple of questions about these numbers? So would it be reasonable to say that you have 420 overdoses that we know of that somehow would be called into you? Is that right?
Yes.
Would it be reasonable to say that that number probably is much lower, or at minimum, let's start with lower. It's certainly on the low end of the number of overdose deaths, right? Overdose cases. You don't hear about every one of them.
No, we don't hear about every one of them. A lot of, I don't know if a lot, we don't know, because there might be some self-treating from Narcan.
So if a family member were to treat with Narcan, for example, you might not ever hear about that.
We might not, no.
And the use of Narcan would have gone up pretty dramatically from 2016 to 2018. That's a question.
I believe it would be, just because Narcan's more prevalent now. I mean, it's being handed out, it's easier to get.
So my question would be, is there a possibility that we still have a similar number of overdoses? It's just that they're being treated with Narcan and not being reported?
I would say no.
I'm trying to rain on your good numbers here to see if...
No, I know you're trying to rain on my good numbers here, but no, I don't believe that's the case. I mean, you can get all the facts and figures you want, but the real story is people, reporters, police, fire, doctors, social workers who are out there in the community every day talking to people, talking to addicts, talking to people who overdose, and they'll tell you they're moving away from the heroin and the fentanyl just because it's so dangerous. And they're trying to either quit totally or switching to meth or other drugs.
Zach, that's not what I heard you say, though. I didn't hear you say that, wow, I didn't know it was that dangerous. Maybe I'll try something else.
The one thing, caveat I will put to that is fentanyl was not around when I got clean in 2014, which is before fentanyl hit, and that is, even to me as a former addict, mind-blowing, the strength of fentanyl and the stories that you read about it. Yeah, for people in the midst of the addiction, that was certainly never something I worried about. But then again, when I was getting clean, we weren't really even talking about this on it wasn't a discussion really being had in the country. I've had experiences. I've overdosed. If I'm being completely honest, the first thing I did after I overdosed was shot up again. It took me about 10 minutes to go from seizing out to putting another needle in my arm. So I think it's different. But I'm one person. I've had one experience, and it certainly wasn't. It wasn't talked about like it is now, and I would not have had any of the information that addicts today would have.
Marlene, as you report this story, we don't hear what Lieutenant Garrow just said, that there is some reason to believe we might be at the top of this.
Well, actually, as I mentioned, the medical examiner in Cuyahoga County did indicate that earlier in the year that he thought maybe things were leveling off. And I have heard that from some addiction specialists in town, that they think maybe folks are moving on to other drugs, as you mentioned. But one thing I wanted to mention here, too, is that one of the other particulars to Cuyahoga County, I don't know if this is true in other places, is the problem of using opioids and heroin has moved from a primarily white addiction. It was primarily a white rural addiction problem, an overdose problem, and it's now moving into the minority community in Cleveland. So the numbers are continuing to climb of African Americans who are starting to overdose, and that's something that they're just seeing in the past couple years. I also wanted to mention, I brought along a piece to play today about Narcan, because Narcan is so central to this discussion that we're having in terms of helping to reduce the overdoses.
Say a word about Narcan. Let's just assume for a minute that somebody's here don't know what Narcan is.
Narcan is, I think the clinical name is naloxone, and it's a drug it's an antidote. So if a person is overdosing and they're given a shot of Narcan, or if it's injected into their nose or sniffed into their nose, it will help revive them right away. And I'm sure that you might agree with me on this, that some first responders are, this is what Narcan looks like. This is the nasal. So first responders can put it like right in the person's nose if they don't have a large amount of drugs in their system. Some people, especially if they've taken fentanyl, these don't work. So they have to give them an injection in order to bring them back, or maybe 2 or 3 doses of an injection to bring them back. But some first responders, and we're here talking about ethics today, are wondering about this drug, although it's a wonderful drug and it's saving lives, and of course their first duty is to save a life. But they're seeing the same people over and over again, and they're starting to wonder about that. So I did a piece where I talked to first responders about how they're feeling about this, and we have a short video.
Piece, and Lieutenant Garrow, after the piece is over with, I want you to respond to what you see here. I want to talk about what we're asking you to do.
Across Northeast Ohio, paramedics like Jeff Jones are racing to save people with Narcan, also known as naloxone, from overdosing on heroin and other opioids. In Lorain, a call comes into 911 that a man is unconscious at McDonald's on the edge of town. Jones is on the scene in minutes.
I was behind getting ready to order my food at McDonald's, and he was in front of me. As I'm ordering my food, he drives into the woods. The ladies came out of McDonald's and was like, just leave him. You don't have Narcan. You can't save him.
The ambulance crew and police arrive a few minutes later and jump in the car to help.
He was purple, bluish color. He was slumped over to the right side, and like I said, I tried getting an IV in his hand, but due to all the scar tissue from previous use of shooting up heroin, it was hard to access there, so I went to his external jugular vein on the left side.
Within 15 seconds of receiving 2 doses of Narcan in his neck, the man walks from the car on his own power to a stretcher, alert but still disoriented.
We're going to take you to the hospital and get you checked out, okay? Jones is relieved he saved the man's life, but he's also angry about what could have happened.
We're lucky he didn't hit some small child coming across the street, getting their McDonald's, coming out with mom, getting their car.
Life Care EMS, which responds to Lorraine, Elyria, and Amherst, is administering Narcan in record numbers.
They were looking at probably about an hour.
It jumped from 669 doses in 2015 to over 1,100 doses in 2016. Jones says they're running through Narcan like water, and he wonders if he's helping the people with this disease of addiction or enabling them.
It's almost like you're condoning the use of a illegal narcotic.
Jones and other Northeast Ohio first responders are torn as the number of overdoses continue to rise. Also adding to the frustration is the increasing number of repeat overdose calls from the same address.
911, what's the address to your emergency?
Yeah, I have a kid here OD'd upstairs.
You know for a fact he overdosed?
I'm pretty sure.
Okay.
Him and the other one up there. I'm sure it's heroin.
This 911 call to Parma EMS is the third call for help for an overdose from the same address, according to fire officials. The number of repeat calls, which some refer to as frequent flyers, is increasing.
We've had a mother in the morning who unfortunately was unable to be pulled through out of the overdose. We had a son in the afternoon and a daughter in the evening, all from the same family at the same location.
Heroin is very cheap. In some cases, it's cheaper than a six-pack of beer. And it's being laced with very powerful and lethal opioids, fentanyl and carfentanil. First responders say they're responding to overdose calls with groups of people who have shot up from the same bad batch.
What happens is they get invited over with other friends and they decide they're going to do heroin together. It's sort of called a Narcan party or a Dawn party. After the famous Dawn kit.
He's referring to Project Dawn, a statewide program which makes Narcan kits available with training to family and friends to help save their loved one in the case of an overdose. The Ohio Health Department says over 1,200 overdoses were reversed with these kits between 2015 and 2016. And in Cuyahoga County, some 900 lives have been saved over the past 5 years, says Metro Health's Dr. Joan Papp. Dr. Papp says addiction is a disease. People will continue to use whether Narcan is available or not.
When a person's administered naloxone, it's because they are on death's door. And when we give them naloxone, we're saving their life. And if naloxone weren't available, they wouldn't survive, they wouldn't have the opportunity to recover.
Tremont resident Annalise Mobasari's boyfriend is one of those lives saved by a Project Dawn naloxone kit. Her boyfriend has been fighting a heroin addiction for years. She attended the training and has saved his life 3 times after he overdosed.
I talked to my friends about it, and they told me I'm crazy and that I need to walk away, and I'm wasting my time. But you don't give up on someone. You just don't. I'm not wasting my time. I'm saving someone's life.
Marlene, thank you for that. Lieutenant Garrow, what do you feel like we're expecting of you and your cohorts out on first responders? I thought you were in law enforcement.
Well, I'm not sure what the public expects from the police or anyone else or the government as a whole, for that matter. That's for you guys to answer, not for me. The police department is tasked with upholding the laws of the state of Ohio, city of Akron, and we go out there and do that. Right now, certain drugs are illegal, and we try to enforce that law. I thought that, the piece showed a little bit of compassion fatigue with some of the responders, and I can understand that. I could understand, compassion fatigue hits with even the families of the addicts. If I were free to just steer this in any way I want to steer this, I would suggest to you guys out there that, one, the problem is getting better. It's not as bad as we think. And two, the problem really isn't so much right now as opioids, it's addiction and mental health. I saw that you put up some stats about using rate in prison. I mean, prisons are a dumping ground for the mental ill. Most people that have addiction problems are mentally ill. I'm not going to say all. I will say this, that you know, the government, including the police department, the medical community, and journalists were running behind the ball on this. The height of this problem was 2 years ago. And that's when we needed the state funding, and we needed the knowledge, and we needed the expertise, and we didn't have it. And I think it's coming around now, but I'm telling you, the problem is moving on. I think that we need to refocus now and realize that this isn't just opioids, it's addiction, and it's the society we live in. I went down to the medical examiner's office yesterday for Summit County because I knew I'd be here today. As of yesterday, in the whole county of Summit, they had 58 confirmed overdose deaths from whether fentanyl, carfentanil, whatever. 58. They had 61 suicides so far this year in the county of Summit. You know, I'm not sure that these two things are separate. I'm not sure that the society that we live in, and it's a supply and demand society, especially the younger people out here, as I look out here, if you want some marijuana or weed or whatever you're calling it these days, kush, I'm sure, despite the fact of the DEA, the Summit County Drug Task Force, Border Patrol and Customs, that any one of you can go out here and within about 10 minutes probably find yourself some marijuana if you know who to call. And you probably know who to call. People want it. People want to be pain-free like you brought up. They expect to be pain-free. They don't want to do the work to not, you know, to lower their cholesterol or their diabetes. They want to take a pill or a shot. We've become a pill society. This is supply and demand. As long as the people up here want to get high, and why do they want to get high? They're dissatisfied with life, they're risk takers, they're just, you know, some kind of emptiness they're trying to fill. I don't know. But as long as that's going on, this problem isn't going to go away. And it's more of a mental, I think, problem than just a drug problem.
Amelia Sharon, how did you get connected with what became an epidemic?
I personally have a lot of experience with the epidemic, along with mental health, addiction, and recovery. I myself do have mental illness. I have depression, anxiety, and OCD. And then I also grew up in a house of recovery. I grew up being 12-stepped without even knowing it. So it really helped me solve a lot of problems and issues in my life. I personally fell down a hole for quite some time. I'm not very comfortable talking about it, but I'm still slowly but surely crawling back out of it, and I'm doing better.
Tell me about your high school classmates.
So within a time span of about 4 years, I graduated from Howland High School, which is located in Warren, Ohio. We had lost 8 former students within that community. I had a friend of mine from high school just last year who was 3 days before he was going into inpatient rehabilitation center, was murdered by his drug dealer. And his body was found 2 weeks later on a hot August day. That man who killed him, I actually went to high school, like a neighboring high school with him. I knew exactly who he was. The community was distraught. And like what you said, it's not just an opioid issue. Of course, that's what we're here for. That is a main reason. However, it does fall under the entirety of an umbrella of it being addiction and mental health. Why do we turn to drugs? Why do we turn to opioids? Think of the ethics in itself. Why? It's because they do want to feel painless. They're trying to fill a void. They're trying to be numb from something that they're feeling so intensely that they're sick and tired of going through, or even through prescription pain medication with athletes and dancers, or even just to do it because other people are doing it. Personally, I relate back to a lot of high school health education classes, which I personally found absolutely pointless. They were pointless. How many of you learned in high school, don't do drugs, they're bad, you'll die? How many? All of you? Precisely. Instead of just being so vague as that, why are they bad? Why do you die? What is it? What is the intricate science behind the use of drugs? What is the history of drugs? Why are opioids bad? Where did they derive from?
So each one of these folks here, Zach tells his personal story. It's one way that he can do something to raise awareness. Marlene, as a journalist, tells these kinds of stunning, intimate stories that she tells. Lieutenant Garrow even risks his life. He wouldn't be that dramatic probably, but he does. He spends his time and energy trying to enforce laws but keep us safe as well. What are you doing?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
That was the longest introduction in the history of the world.
So I grew up with the healthy coping mechanisms of the arts. I grew up with theater, dance, cartooning, and I loved it to no end. It's who made me I am today. And I met the amazing people I have throughout it, which I owe my life to, literally. Youngstown Playhouse, all throughout high school, they have saved my life countless times. I turned to the arts. There was the photo of the infamous East Liverpool car fiasco of the grandmother, her boyfriend, and the child. Huge ethical issue. That should be an entirely different conference. Oh my goodness. But that really sparked something in me, looking at it, whether people were fighting over that cop had no right to post that photo, or those people's faces should have been blurred. But then they're people. You're wondering about the ethics behind this photo, but what about the people in the photo? What are you going to do for them? So with that case, I decided to just talk to people, try to educate myself on different perspectives. And I ended up accidentally interviewing about 50 people, anywhere from nurses, doctors, teachers, counselors, teenagers, current users, recovering people, their family, and I took all of their personalities, all of their experiences, all of their amazing stories, and I put them into a play. I've read a lot of scripts, I've done a lot of plays, so I just kind of Googled a format and I wrote it. But I had my dear friend Zach Manthe, who's my co-writer, jump along and help me finish the piece. So we locked ourselves in my apartment for about 3 days with the ambient noise of John Mulaney and eating pizza fire, and we hashed it out. About 2 months later, Akron Civic Theater debuted it August 4th and 5th, and it was a dream come true. We had raised over $700 and about 50 items for the Oriana House. The deal is, this is more than just a play. This is more than just a play based off of real-life characters following the paths of two people who are suffering from addiction, one with support, one with no support, and it shows you where they end up. It personifies heroin. It shows you the discussion of what we have with these drugs, with these thoughts in our heads, what she tells us. She's a temptress.
The whole idea, it seems to me that part of the idea is to make this a conversation that we can all experience and identify with.
Precisely, because this is a form of artistic activism that is bringing education and awareness to different communities, not just in Ohio, but in Massachusetts, out in Colorado, I think up in Canada, 2020, I don't know. But it's something that is really starting the conversation in an entertaining manner, because like we said earlier, you're stuck in school, they lecture you, don't do drugs, you'll die. Why?
Marlene, if this is the kind of performance, this is the kind of engagement that we can have with the public, why is there so much pushback on issues like naloxone? Why do we hear people say we shouldn't be encouraging this? We should be doing what the health classes say. Yeah. Just don't do it. Why is there so much pushback?
Well, I think part of the pushback is financial. I mean, when I've heard people push back on the use of naloxone, it's usually around how much this is costing taxpayers.
Do we know a real number?
I don't know the number off the top of my head. Maybe some of the other folks here
Greg,
know.
You probably know that. What does naloxone cost? $72 a kit. So that, would that be $72? That, oh,
Well, that's a different type. What we give inside the Project Dawn kit is the 2 milligrams, you get 2 doses. But that's actually a little bit more expensive.
this is more expensive.
Which is why we stick with the old orange box.
So
Right.
$72 for one of these.
Or show up to a Project Dawn training and get it for free.
Or get it for free if you show up.
But the cost issue
we're-
usually is around municipalities having to purchase it. For the EMS crews, it's blowing out people's budgets, that kind of
So,
thing.
Lieutenant Garrow, your colleagues are going around with this stuff in their patrol cars, and they're administering these doses pretty often.
We used to. I mean, the usage is down now, but yeah, a couple of years ago, it was a daily event.
Okay, so Marlene,
So the
a
cost-
daily event.
Daily, multiple times a day.
Multiple times daily,
I've
yeah.
Narcaned somebody back from, the brink.
I could expect to spend, if I were a patrol officer, I'm just trying to get down to, I could expect to spend a couple $100 a day administering Narcan.
The city's paying for it.
But I mean,
Sure. Here's my question. I mean, resources are finite, okay? Yeah, it does cost a lot of money, and I think that it's good to have an open discussion and consider things. Here's something I consider sometimes. I think it's great that we all have Narcan and we're saving people's lives, but we're providing it for free or the city's picking up the cost. Are you aware what an EpiPen costs? It's about $500 now. You got some third grader who's allergic to peanut butter, and he's got to come up with his own $500 worth of
Exactly.
EpiPen, and yet the city's, I don't think it's wrong. I think that we need to get this out there, but we've got to pick and choose. Why is one getting the attention as opposed to the other? I don't know.
And that's something that you hear a lot too. The other pushback you hear is on something that you mentioned earlier about medicated assisted treatment, whether it's in prisons or whether people are accessing it on their own in the community. When a person is addicted and they try to get off, the gold standard for treatment that we hear from professionals is some form of medicated assisted treatment along with counseling and then connecting that person to a 12-step program. This is known, this is not some revelation, this is something that the community has known for a long time. Yet there's pushback even within the addiction treatment community to people using medicated assisted treatment. Some people who, if you want to call the old school 12-step programs, they don't see the person as being totally abstinent from the drug if they're using medication, Suboxone or something, or Vivitrol to help them with their addiction. So they're even rejected from some of those 12-step groups. Some sober houses won't allow people to come and stay at those sober houses if they're taking Suboxone. So even out in the community, people who are trying to get clean with the help of these medications are finding resistance.
Zach, what I heard you describe was less a choice than an illness. Did I hear that right?
Yeah, I think absolutely. And that's when you go to rehab, 12-step programs, that's what they describe it as, a disease.
It's a disease.
Yeah, and I know there's debate, I think in the medical community and society about that because some people view it as giving people an excuse to use drugs. It's a disease, but it's one where the steps to treat it are very obvious, and it requires action on the on the behalf of the user. But yeah, it definitely reaches a point where it's not a choice anymore. I mean, you have to make that initial choice to use. That's I'm not going to say that wasn't there. There's the initial choice to use, but you reach a point where it's not a choice, where you don't want to get up and use, but you don't really have an option because otherwise you're not getting out of bed.
If I think of it this way, Lieutenant Garrow, so here I am, I'm a fat guy, you show up, I'm having my 63-year-old heart attack. Would I expect that EMTs would show up and say, hey, fat guy, if you hadn't eaten that pizza, you probably wouldn't be having this heart attack. I think we won't be saving you today. After all, you should have known better. If it's an illness, if it's a disease, it seems like a bad time to be making a judgment about whether you're going to be saving me today or not. And yet, that's where the debate puts your crew, is to say, wow, should I be even trying to save this person, as we saw in the one story. It was in the Cincinnati Enquirer story, where a sheriff doesn't even want their people carrying naloxone, right? I don't want to be in that business. If you had it in your power to say yes, administer to everyone who needs, or no, make a judgment, if this is their third stop, no more, where would you make that judgment?
I think life's difficult enough without other people adding to the difficulty. You know, you try to help out as people as much as you can. You know, I won't lie.
There's a quote that I hope ends up on the tweet board somewhere. You try to help people as much as you can.
But the sympathy factor, I mean, there are many people I deal with that I've got very little sympathy for because to a large extent we make our own problems. I do. I make my own problems. I think most people make their own problems by what they let into their life and how they choose to lead their life. The sympathy might not be there for the frequent flyers, as you call it, whether it's someone who drinks too much or takes alcohol or just the couple that can't stop fighting because that's what they do and they fight and we're at the house 24 times, you know, in a month. But we still go and we try to be professional and help them and you know, try to improve their life and get on with the business.
I want to go in the minutes that we have left. I want to go down the table. I'm going to start with Amelia, and I'm just going to come down the table. If you could implore the journalists, particularly who are watching this, to cover the story of opioids and addiction and even mental health that Lieutenant Garrow has raised to us, what would you have us do? It's a two-part question. What would you have us do more of and less of, or stop doing? Through your eyes, what should we do that would be useful? More of and less of. Amelia.
Get people comfortable with the uncomfortable. Just because they don't like what you're saying does not mean it's true.
Say that again.
Just because they do not like what you're saying does not mean it's not reality. And you need to help them understand that, sure, you may have these opinions, you may have these experiences, but this is right in front of you. This is why independent is based off of 50 different perspectives. Because in the end, would you rather write something that is so educational, brings so much awareness that it moves someone, it makes them want to act, it makes them want to be impactful, it makes them want to volunteer? For example, with this instance, with that small bottle being so expensive, would you rather spend $15 for a ticket to an informational, educational show that could possibly help you help someone else, or that helps you better understand something that is so misunderstood in society that we just become a pill pusher community and say, oh, you don't feel well, take this? Or would you rather spend so much money on a teeny tiny bottle that could save someone's life?
And what would you have us stop doing? Again, you now have the power of the universe to shape journalism. You would have us do what?
Stop the judgment.
Stop judgment.
Stop shaming.
Lieutenant Garrow, what would you have us do more of? What would you have us do less of or stop?
I think I would tell the journalists out there, and I think most of you are journalists, is that if you're focusing solely on the opioid epidemic, you're 2 years behind the time. That story is a small subset of the addiction mental health story, and that's really what the problem is. So stop doing that. The other thing I might suggest that you stop doing is focusing on the TV Brady Bunch, middle white class story of addiction. It's across the whole society at this point. The mentally ill people, the addicted people are not always blonde hair and blue-eyed and homecoming queens. It's getting everybody. Try to tell a true story. Don't take the easy way out and just look at statistics and what's been going on in the newspaper for the past 2-3 years. Get out there and talk to people that are on the street every day and living it.
Marlene, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question as a practitioner.
Yes.
Give us some advice as to how you get to keep covering this story over and over again when so many are just sick of the story. How do you get the assignment desk to say yes?
That is a huge challenge, trying to find new ways to tell this story over and over. One thing I would say is that I hear what you're saying, and I have heard that too, that it's moving on. But I think we can't forget this large group of people who are addicted out there. And there's still our societal cost to them personally and to our society as a whole, to all of these people. What's going to happen to them? What are we going to do? Just wait till they all die off? So I think as journalists, one of the ways that we can start to cover this story differently is to focus more on the solutions, focus more on medically assisted treatment, for example. I think there's a lot of people in the community who don't have the facts about how that works. And as journalists, we can help educate the public as to why this treatment is the only really proven treatment that works out there. And I'd say also, one of the things that's coming down the pike, and some people have reported on it, one of my colleagues, the managing editor of our team, Kay Colby, did a report on the fact that these people who are addicted, one of the things that happens after years and years of this abuse is it starts to affect the heart valves. And we were talking about this last night. So there are people, really young people, who need transplants of their heart valves because they've been using. And this is a very, very expensive treatment. And it's an ethical question that the medical community is dealing with right now, is who can get these transplants? If you're a person who's going to be a frequent flyer, and we've spent multi-thousands of dollars to have you have this transplant, and then you're going to come back in a few years and you're going to need it again. So that's another story out there that journalists are starting to cover. So we have to just keep looking at new ways of looking at the consequences to us as a society, and always, always talk to real people. That's what we try to do.
Zach, we come to you for some advice. What would you have us do more of or stop doing?
More of, my first thought is the 7 Days of Heroin piece from the Cincinnati Enquirer. That's, I know, Pulitzer Prize is a high bar, but that's what I would say more of, pieces like that took the time to, really get a piece out there that touches on every facet of it. And, I was really honored to ask to be here, but I was most excited about getting to come and hear from those people that write that piece, because I think that is, that's the pinnacle, that's the standard for what you should write. For less of, I would say looking to any sort of government or legislative answer to the issue. This week that made the rounds, especially here in Ohio, because Sherrod Brown and Senator Portman's bill got passed, and from my perspective, and this is maybe an evergreen statement, nothing's probably going to get done that's coming out of the Senate, and it's probably not going to fix this issue. So it's a community issue, and it's a community-based issue, and that's where the solutions are going to come from. It's not going to come from up on high from Capitol Hill or wherever.
Because I'm an educator and I believe in outcomes, I'd like for you in the group, and those of you joining us by Twitter, what stands between you and a bathroom break right now is you proving that you've learned 4 things in this session. Somebody shout out one thing that you're taking away from this session. We're going to do 4 things, and on Twitter, I'd like for you to tweet in a tweet size, what's something you're thinking about now that you weren't thinking about an hour ago because of this conversation? Somebody shout out one. Stop shaming. Because why would you say that? Why should we stop shaming? Fill out that conversation. It puts the person in the same cycle. I'm repeating not to mock you, but so the group can, actually I may be mocking you. I'm repeating so the audience can hear you. Go ahead. 2?
Like if you shame him or her,
absolutely,
they will be in the same cycle where they were before.
Shaming just puts you in the same cycle. Yes. Perfect. 2.
Going for drug.
I'm going to repeat. Go ahead.
Talking to real people.
Talk to real people.
As journalists, we talk to people every day, but I think in this sort of time we really need to actually listen, actively listen.
Imagine that. We have to actively listen.
How they're being affected, by this crisis. Even if they have a friend that's being affected, how are they feeling? And just what solutions do people have versus us? Ooh, thank you. Versus us just going to like legislators of those in power to figure out solutions. Like,
I'll ask our Cincinnati Inquirer group a little later how to do that. Hold me responsible for asking that question, will you?
Got it.
Great. 3. Go ahead. Just shout it out. Use all means possible, even theater and music and public education, everything we can do to get there. Love that. 4. Go ahead.
Media agencies need to work harder to show that addiction is a universal problem.
Addiction is a universal problem, and media need to go there.
And we shouldn't just cover it when it's white people dying in the streets. We need to go back to the reality of the situation and
Very good.
start focusing on that.
Team, it seems as though you've taught something today. Thank you for your work, and thanks for teaching us.